Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you are. My name is Meelis, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar on the economic consequences of pandemic COVID-19. What we're going to do in this webinar is that we are going to assess the current economic developments from different perspectives, and we are going to discuss some of the consequences and the developments that might occur in the short term, discussing what kind of recovery should we expect. And also we are going to discuss some of the implications for the longer term economic development, particularly in the United States and in Europe. And I have been joined by very distinguished panelists who come from different cities in Europe and US, and I'm very happy to introduce briefly them. First, we have Dan Mitchell joining us from Washington, DC. Dan is a public policy economist. He has published widely on public economics issues, has worked for a number of think tanks, among them the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you.
Then we have Ivan Miklos, who is a very experienced policymaker from Slovakia. He has been a Minister of Finance, he has been Minister of Privatization, he has been Deputy Prime Minister of Slovakia, but in addition to that, he's a founder of a major think tank in Slovakia, has served as a president of this think tank, and is currently advising, and has been advising for a while, Ukrainian government on a number of issues related to finance and economics. And our third speaker is Mark Bathgate, who is a macro strategist joining us from London. Mark has had a long career in finance and banking. He has worked for Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, among others, has run several hedge funds out of London across the globe. And our fourth speaker is Kaspar, who is an economist from Eesti Pank, which is a central bank in Estonia. Kaspar works for the forecasting team of Bank of Estonia, and he's widely known as one of the most cited and well-known economists in Estonia. He's also pursuing his PhD at the University of Tartu in economics. So welcome, Kaspar. So first, I would like to give floor to Dan, or screen to be more precise, and Dan can share his thoughts on the current developments and how we should expect things to turn out in the short run and in the long run. So please, Dan, floor or screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much. What I'm going to do is put a presentation up on the screen and discuss and sort of just follow through a couple of slides on this issue. And I'm just really going to talk about three issues, one after the other, assuming I can figure out how to advance the slide, and I did. First, the economic damage, which is, of course, very severe and is, I think, going to last, unfortunately, a long time. Then I want to specifically touch on perhaps, I guess we would call it the fiscal element of this. Will there be a second fiscal crisis, especially in some European nations? And then I want to close up with a few thoughts on the cost-benefit analysis that we're currently going through in many American states, which is whether to reopen the economy, how to reopen the economy, and how to weigh the trade-offs on these issues. And I'll start with the economic outlook. And I'll admit right up front, I have no idea how deep the downturn will be. But there's no question we're going to be somewhere far greater in terms of at least short-run damage than the financial crisis, the Great Recession, whatever you want to call what we went through a little bit over 10 years ago. But the real issue, the real challenge is trying to figure out what happens as the coronavirus is well, hopefully cured, but whether it's a vaccine, whether it's more effective treatment, or whether it's simply the fact that you can't keep economy shut down forever without really catastrophic consequences, how will the economy rebound? What will we see? I don't think it'll be a V-shaped recovery. I desperately hope that's the case. That's obviously the best scenario for improving people's lives, for restoring income, for improving public finances. But unless we have a very quick development of a vaccine, or unless we have some really silver bullet type treatment regimen that's developed, I fear that we're going to have a very lengthy economic bout of economic suffering from this, because even if governments reopen their economies, a lot of businesses are not going to go back to normal. A lot of people are simply going to be afraid, and they're not going to go out and work. They're not going to go out and shop. So I think the most likely realistic, albeit pessimistic, assumption that we have is that there's a long period of economic stagnation in front of us. And even when people begin to go out into the economy, you're going to see secondary bouts of the coronavirus, and that's going to cause sort of this start and stop system, again, barring something really dramatic and positive in terms of healthcare treatment, vaccines, something like that. So I fear that there's a deep and permanent loss of prosperity that we're going to suffer. And then one of the consequences of this economic suffering is that public finances are really taking a terrible toll. Now, I'm obviously more familiar with the numbers in the United States. We're talking about trillions of dollars of additional outlays, deficits approaching the level that we haven't seen since World War II. Now, given the pandemic, I'm not arguing with the notion that some of these actions are necessary. However, we are going to deal with a situation where at some point, people, depending on the country that they're in, are going to say, I don't really trust that this government will pay me back if I lend it money. That's really what defines a fiscal crisis. There's not some magic point where you reach 90% of debt to GDP, which has been in the academic literature as potentially a tipping point. I don't think that's really the case. It all depends on the specific government and what we're dealing with. And since we're dealing with something really horrific with this pandemic, where we're going to see budget deficits explode, both because of the coronavirus-related spending, but also the economic shutdown is leading to a collapse in tax revenue. There are even estimates in the US that tax revenue could fall below 10% of GDP. Now, I've always wanted to get to a situation where tax revenue was that small, but I didn't want to get there in this way for this reason. And certainly I wanted it because of small government, not because of an economic downturn. Now, I'm going to show you a slide of different countries and their debt to GDP ratio before the coronavirus. But keep in mind that we don't know who's going to be hit by a financial crisis because we don't know what the sentiment of investors is going to be. And perhaps most importantly, we have no idea what the European Central Bank might be doing. But I'll simply put this chart up on the screen, showing on the left side, you have some countries like Switzerland, Australia, Sweden, and the Netherlands. But on the right side, Japan, of course, is the worst country. But again, it's not one I expect to.
So apparently we have lost Dan, so there is some kind of connection issue that occurred. So Ivan, while we're waiting for Dan to come back, would you like to continue? Or is Dan back?
Shall I start?
Yeah, maybe while Dan kind of gets back online, you could continue. So sorry about that, but you never know with those networks across Atlantic how they work out. So so maybe you can just say some of your reflections and thoughts, and then we can let Dan continue once he's able to establish the connection. So please.
Okay, hello everybody. Let me start by saying that my country, Slovakia, is one of the best by number of people who died from COVID-19. We have only 23 people until now who died. It was mainly because it was very quickly the provided lockdown of the country. But on the other side, this lockdown will bring, of course, very serious economic consequences. We expect that recession will be around 10% this year, as well as fiscal deficit. And still we don't know, of course, how long it will take. If it will be second wave, it will be even worse. From the global point of view, situation is really serious. Everybody knows it now. The biggest problem, I think, is that we still don't know when it will finish and how it will be finished, how long it will take, which means every new prognosis is worse than the last one. Regarding the problem, one of the problem is that now we are facing not only demand shock but also supply shock at the same time, which means consequences will be really serious. Another important point is that even before COVID-19 crisis, Corona crisis, situation in global economy was not simple, not easy, especially because from global financial crisis and global economic crisis 2008-2009, the global debt grew up quicker than global economy. And this is one of the biggest problems, that even in 2019, the global debt was 200 overall debt. I mean, corporate debt and public debt was 290% of global GDP, which is, of course, very high number. What we can expect that after this crisis, it will be even much bigger. And this will create a lot of problems from point of view of sustainability, from point of view of how to cover this debt, if there will be not new threat of inflation. If inflation will grow, of course, then the question of sustainability of indebtedness will be even more severe, because, of course, the interest rates have to be higher as well. Which means I agree with regarding short-term consequences. Still, one of the problems is that we don't know how deep recession will be. But I agree with Dan that I don't expect that it will be V-shaped recovering. One of the reasons is that even before crisis, as I said, it was difficult situation. For instance, IMF estimates that in the developed countries, significant part of corporate debt was very risky, even before crisis. Which means after crisis, it will be even more difficult. Which means we cannot expect that it will be V-shaped, in my opinion, because all this legacy from the past. Even after global financial crisis, we saw that the global growth was slower than before. It was connected also with the slower growth of trade. After this crisis, we can expect that it will be new type of globalization, which means free trade in connection with consequences of crisis, but also even before Corona crisis, we saw this economic nationalism growing, this protectionist tendencies in the politics, and so on and so on. And it is necessary to know that international trade is about 60% of global GDP, which means we can expect that new conditions after Corona crisis will be more difficult, not only from point of view of indebtedness and legacy in the increasing fiscal deficits, but also in new model of international cooperation and international economics. Regarding European Union, especially Eurozone, let me say also a few words. We can expect that after Corona crisis, it will be on the table very acute problem of the Eurozone sustainability, especially because the Corona crisis will have the most negative economic consequences, as well as consequences for the number of people who died. Economic consequences as well will be the most difficult in Italy and Spain, especially. And of course, situation in these countries was difficult even before crisis. We can expect, and the expectation is that the Italian debt, public debt, will increase from today's about 130 to somewhere 165, 170% of GDP. And it will be very acutely on the table the problem of sustainability, especially from point of view of competitiveness. The biggest problem, in my opinion, from the beginning in Eurozone is that it is increasing difference between southern and northern countries in competitiveness. And this is the main reason why Euro will be, from mid and long-term perspective, unsustainable if this tendency of increasing this gap, this difference in competitiveness will further increase. And as we can see, I expect that it will be necessary to have some kind of more solidarity, especially through Corona bonds or some other instruments. But the problem of North is that, especially, you know that today, especially Germany and Netherlands are against this. Main reason, in my opinion, is that they understand and that they understood that it will be necessary to have this kind of mechanism for solidarity. But what they are afraid that, or what they expect to have as well, to have some mechanism which will increase probability, or at least decrease risk that these certain countries will not provide necessary reforms. Because only way how to decrease this competitive difference is that southern countries have to provide much more structural reforms and other economic reform, which is of course politically very sensitive. My expectation is, and I'm telling this many years, but now it will be even more acute, that without some kind of exit rule in Eurozone, it will be simply impossible to solve. Which means, in my opinion, it will be after crisis, it will be only possibility how to sustain Eurozone will be on one side to have more solidarity through Corona bonds or another tools, but at the same time to have some mechanism which will solve this dilemma and which will push countries which will not provide necessary reforms out of the Eurozone. But important is that it has to be a kind of automatic rule, which not to rule by voting by consensus, for instance, because every time it will be some countries, there will be some countries which will never vote against anybody because they expect that they will have or they should have the same problem in future. Which means, let me conclude by saying that, another important point is that we still don't know which strategy will be the most successful. I mean, which strategy fighting against this coronavirus. We have this kind of Asian strategy done by South Korea, Singapore and Hong Kong, which was mass testing and without lockdown of economy fighting by very, very intelligent quarantine. Then we have lockdown, which is done by most of developed countries today. And then we have still also Swedish model, which is more relied on still opening economy, just partial lockdown, and more for gaining this collective immunity. It seems to be by number of deaths that this is not that the best way is lockdown. But I'm afraid that it is now impossible to say which strategy is the best. We will be able to say it only after this crisis. After this crisis will be overcome, and then it will be necessary to count not only how many people died, but of course also what was the damage for economy, unemployment, fiscal deficit, indebtedness, and also this healthcare consequences from higher unemployment, violence, and everything connected, psychological problems, and everything connected with this. Which means, let me conclude that it seems that we don't know. We will see it only after this crisis will be overcome. But clear, even today, it is very clear. It is clear that this crisis is very, very serious, and economy, including global economy, will not repeat to the same model of functioning as it was before crisis.
Great. Thank you very much for this very splendid discussion. So I'm happy to see that Dan is back and you're able to hear us. So meanwhile, we actually continued with I'm Miklos, and he was able to offer his perspective. He basically agreed with you that we shouldn't expect V-shaped recovery, that will be probably more difficult than that, and discussed also some of the distributional implications in Europe, particularly between Northern and Southern European countries. So Dan, would you like to continue where you stopped, and and then we can go to the next speaker. So I would give a screen back to you, if you don't mind. Your mic is not on. Please turn on your mic.
There we go. Obviously, technology is not my strong suit here. Apologies for the primitive internet that I must have here. Let me go ahead and go back to my presentation. I was talking about the potential for some sort of a bailout by the European Central Bank. That's questionable. I don't know whether that will happen. We, of course, have the same issue in the United States, whether the federal government should borrow additional money to bail out various state governments. That's an open question right now. Let me go ahead and wrap up my presentation, though, by touching on this issue of cost-benefit analysis. And I could hear when I got back online that Ivan Miklos was talking about some of these issues as well. The original goal, of course, was to flatten the curve, to make sure that healthcare systems weren't overwhelmed with serious cases. It seems most countries have succeeded with that, but the goalposts have now been moved where politicians and also people are saying, well, we're just scared, we don't want to do anything. But then, of course, that gets into a whole separate issue, which is what are the health consequences of an economic shutdown? What are the health consequences of lower GDP? And there is, in the academic literature, a very well-established relationship that the richer a society is, the healthier a society is, the higher the longevity of the population is. So if we keep economies shut down, we'll have fewer deaths from coronavirus, we'll have less risk of secondary outbreaks of infection from coronavirus, but we're going to have long-term consequences in terms of diminished health outcomes and diminished longevity because of the coronavirus. And this is something that's very well established. I'm showing here a page from a joint study from the American Enterprise Institute, which is center-right, and the Brookings Institution, which is center-left. And the very right part of the screen, which I don't expect anybody to be able to read, it simply measures the net lives saved by different regulations. And if we then blow up part of the screen, you'll see that there are many regulations that the government has done in the United States that ostensibly are designed to improve public safety, but it turns out the economic damage from those regulations was so harsh that these experts from, again, center-right and center-left working together, they estimated that these regulations actually reduced lives in the long run. And my concern is that we're dealing with something similar with the coronavirus, where if we try to keep economies shut down forever, again, barring some sort of great news on vaccines or treatment, in effect, this Venn diagram is the choice that we're sort of going to be facing. Yes, we should worry about the deaths and the harm of coronavirus, but I'm very concerned about that bottom circle, which is the economic damage, especially because that economic damage in the long run also has very negative health consequences. So what are we looking at now? Especially for a think tank person like myself, I wonder whether we're going to have a permanent expansion of the burden of government. Will there be a bigger welfare state? Will there be more trade barriers? Will there be higher tax rates? We have plenty of politicians in the United States that are talking about using this crisis as an excuse to raise tax burdens, to expand the cost and size of government. And of course, I think the fundamental choice that all nations are going to have is that if you make the wrong decisions about not a temporary expansion of government, which is happening all over the world and is understandable, but the real issue in my mind as a public finance economist is what's going to happen in the future. And I'm very concerned that the current ethos among the political class is that they're going to use this virus as an excuse to impose policies that otherwise people hopefully would have realized are not very wise for a country. And so with that, again, I apologize for my internet troubles earlier, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations.
Thanks so much, Dan. Certainly, it was a pleasure to hear your presentation. But before we go to the questions and reactions, I would like to give a floor to Mark Bathgate, who is joining us from London and has been working banking and finance for 25 years or so. So please, Mark, floor is yours. What are your reflections on the current crisis and where we are heading?
Cool, thank you. What I'll try and run through is some degree of what's the scale of the damage so far and what might the next few quarters look like. At the moment, right across Europe and other developed economies, around 30 to 40% of the economy shuts down. So anything hospitality, travel, the majority of retail. That's why, you know, at an annualized rate, economies are contracting by about 35%, so even greater than the Great Depression. ECB are currently talking about a 12 to 15% decline in GDP this year. So we're assessing in terms of its magnitude for the Eurozone that's at least 3 or 4 times greater than 2008. Now, one of the things that's emerging as people look at how do you start unlocking the economy is some sectors are obviously hit very more than others. Probably the single trickiest issue for governments, Europe and internationally to deal with is what happens with travel. In a kind of chaos few days through early to mid-March, as economies sort of basically moved into lockdown, what we saw was right across Schengen and elsewhere, borders closing, both land and air borders, and effectively a lot of repatriation of citizens that's broadly now happened. This is where you have very major impacts. Roughly 10 to 25% of European economies in some way are connected with travel, tourism, hospitality. From say Croatia, there's 20% tourism, Spain that's just under 15. Broadly, obviously a significant north-south, tourists go south in summer. So whereas thus far, most countries had a relatively similar economic hit, locking down around the same times in the same way. As the lockdown starts to unwind, as manufacturing in Central and Northern Europe starts to resume, the differentials of growth within the Eurozone potentially could rise very quickly. If it proves impossible to restore air travel in a credible way, then obviously for Southern Europe that is highly dependent on tourism, and obviously it's a big seasonal thing, that's going to have a second major economic hit. We would be looking at very large rises in unemployment, probably to the 20 to 30% area in some countries, and very large bankruptcies in many sectors. As a guy in the US, which obviously has a much more easy kind of firing culture, we've seen about a 23, 24 million rise in the total number of unemployed in little more than a month, taking the unemployment rate there probably towards 20%. Even I would agree that a V-shaped recovery is extremely unlikely in the coming months. You're looking at a persistence of mass unemployment, which will obviously have significant social, political, and consumption impacts. Another key aspect of the lockdown, obviously, is it's not just air travel, which is down 90-95%. In a lot of countries, car travel is down 80 to 90%. Cumulatively, that has reduced oil consumption per day by around 30 million barrels. Obviously, because oil needs to be stored somewhere safely if it's taken out of the ground, that has pushed global oil storage now close to capacity. So with a 20 million barrel per day supply versus demand gap, you're seeing a rapid acceleration in the lockdown in oil production globally, and not in a coordinated way, in a very forced, where are people running out of money, where are people going bust, where can't people not find storage. That means the energy sector obviously is another source of mass layoffs globally. CapEx in that sector, I think we can reliably say, will be close to zero for at least the next couple of years. So creating supply chain impacts, into Europe. Also, very, very large defaults. There are many companies and many sovereigns, particularly in emerging markets, who are highly dependent on oil revenues for their economic model. And we're likely to see across US shale, across emerging market sovereigns or subordinated sovereigns like Pemex, real risk of default and restructuring, and substantial risk of major debt write-downs will have to be taken by pension funds, insurance companies, obviously have that exposure. So the cumulative effect here working through the system is very, very high. And I think as expectations that this is going to be a longer haul, that we're looking at potentially significant impairment in economic activity, ability to travel. It could run a number of quarters. The key thing is the loss recognition process in financial markets will have to begin. Financial markets have been sort of kept propped up on the Fed is pumping money in, fiscal policy is there. But central banks can provide liquidity where there is solvency. But what they can't do is prevent real economic loss. For example, most of the airports in the UK have very large debt stocks attached to them on the assumption that there's a stable flow of income. There is essentially no income at the moment and little prospect that that income is going to go back to anything normal in coming months. So I think as the default cycle accelerates rapidly as the consequences of unprecedented mass unemployment come through, as ultimately there are levels of government spending or nationalization which it is not unlimited. We move from an economic crisis, we've moved health crisis so far, we're moving into an appreciation of the scale of the economic crisis. I think we move towards, as almost is always the case in major economic financial crisis. I think that's why the next 3 or 4 months in financial markets and for central banks and other policymakers could be very, very challenging. As we've seen in previous recessions, there's always the phase when markets take the view the Fed will fix things, there's been stimulus, it'll all turn around quickly. But ultimately, always you have to have the who's lost the money and the booking the losses of that. A lot of the equity in the global energy and the global aviation sector will largely be destroyed here. And there'll obviously be very, very large debt write-offs. I think we're only at the very front end of an appreciation of those. So that's how it's wanted to make.
All right, thank you, Mark. Thanks so much. And now our last speaker, Kaspar Oja from the Estonian Central Bank, can discuss his views on what we are sort of experiencing now and what is likely to happen in the future. Please, Kaspar.
Okay. I would say that probably the shock on a crisis is very unequal across sectors, at least in the short run. In the short run, we see mostly a kind of supply side effect because we see the lockdown of different sectors. People are staying at home, can't go to work. Many people are afraid of going out, so they also consume less. But in the longer run, probably the shock will be more equal across all the sectors and also across countries. I think the problem is that we haven't seen sort of the second round effect of the crisis yet, and this will probably be on in the poorer economies in Africa and in Asia, which probably will also have some effect on the foreign demand of US and Europe. We've seen in the past that if the oil-producing economies are doing bad, then this shows up in the exports of Germany, for example. So quite probably there will be also a second round effect in the world economy. If you think about previous crisis, then during the so-called Icelandic volcano crisis, which only lasted for a few weeks, there was also partial lockdown of the economy because the airplanes did not fly in Europe. But the economic consequences of this were not so bad in Europe, but they showed up in Africa. So there could be quite significant second round effects, which will probably affect us through external demands. Also, the crisis has a very sort of unequal effect on different groups of people. And we know that the virus affects more the elderly, but probably the lockdown has more effect on the young people, because the young people are the ones who would probably be more socially active. They would also like to go to work, earn some money. And the effects on young people could actually be quite long-lasting. We know it from the education economics that if children get out from school for long enough, then they will start forgetting things, and these effects will be seen in the economy in 10 years, but this will stay with us for a very long time because the generation will be affected in the long run. We also know that economic crises have more effect on young people who graduate from universities because they need to find a job and they need to change the job for sometimes in order to find the best match. And in case of crisis, just the kind of work-life development is weaker, and this has also a long-time impact on their income. What should governments do? I think the first thing is, of course, that there has to be some kind of probably help to people who have suffered the most, so that they can survive the crisis. But the problem is that quite often the governments are using the crisis to do their own economic policy, what just didn't go through during the normal times. And that's why we see also barriers in international trade. We see movement against immigration, things like that. And these are also bad for economy because, there might be many people who are against globalization, but the fact is that globalization has brought us prosperity. Because we actually gain from trading with different countries. It's thought that the economy can come out from the crisis thanks to the domestic sector. That even in case the exporting sector is not doing so well, the domestic sector could somehow start better when epidemic is over. But the problem is that the non-tradable sector or the domestic sector is very much affected by the tradable sector. So if the productivity in the tradable sector goes down, then this also affects the non-tradable sector. So in case we have higher trade barriers in the future, this means probably that we will also have some impact on the domestic economy, not only the exporting sector. So the government should mostly think about helping the market to start working again. So this means getting rid of the barriers from the movement of goods, services, capital, and people. So because this is the thing that will probably bring us the good times back. And I'm not really sure if the situation in the economy and the world has changed so much because usually during the crisis, we become quite pessimistic. And this has been very common that during a crisis, we think that now the world is different. But usually it's not. This is a kind of a very common thing which has been fought during all the crises, I would say, and it has always been wrong. It's just that we should do the policy so that we get rid of the barriers. We do not let populist parties to gain power and tell the and tell entrepreneurs that you are not allowed to trade with foreigners and things like that. So if we keep the market going, we should basically get over the crisis. And the world after the crisis will probably be quite similar to the world before the crisis. And that's, I think, the most important things from me.
All right, thanks so much, Kaspar. Thanks so much for discussing those sort of distributional implications, how different, so before Ivan was discussing how different European countries might be affected by the crisis, but you also went a few steps further, discussed how different sectors, different groups of people might be affected by the crisis, and that's quite splendid. In addition, I think, thanks very much for sort of bringing this sort of political economy issues to the table that I think here everybody more or less agreed that V-shaped recovery is not likely. It's still unclear what kind of recovery might be. Is it L-shaped or is it W-shaped or something else? I think this is still uncertain, but something that was also highlighted was that it depends also the policies that countries will pursue. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind that political rationality is quite different from sort of economic rationality. And politicians often are quite opportunistic and they may use this crisis for the advantage for, to pursue the policies that actually don't help us to get out of the crisis. So I guess sort of the big question here is that how do you grade political incentives? How do you explain it to the politicians? How to, so to say, make right choices that will actually help us out of this crisis by not imposing trade barriers and sort of encouraging free trade, because otherwise, as was pointed out, it's likely that we will see a lot of the protectionist world and the possibility to restore our economic prosperity diminishes. So anybody from the panel, any reactions to the other speakers that you would like to pick up on?
If I may, maybe one very important issue and problem, and it is how this crisis will create threat for political and economic freedom. Because I think what we agree, what is common agreement, is that necessary condition for prosperity and for human development is liberal democracy with free market economy. I mean, the system based on free and fair competition. And this is something what the real situation will create the new threats for this. Political freedom, we can see even now in Hungary, what could happen. And it is clear in every country that if in such extraordinary situation like war or this kind of pandemic crisis, government is taking more and more power, it could be one of the consequences will be that state ownership will be much higher, because state, one of the method how to save the companies will be nationalization, which means first threat is that the role of state will increase significantly, and then state usually doesn't want to leave this power after crisis, if crisis will disappear. Second problem is not only in political area, but in economic area as well, as threat of nationalism. What I'm afraid is what kind of consequences will have crisis itself, and the methods how we are overcoming or how we are fighting with the crisis for inequality. And now inequality in two areas. One is among people, and another is among or between countries. Because even we know that even this period from 2008 until now, one of the reasons of increasing inequality was monetary expansion, quantitative easing. And now we will see even more stronger monetary expansion and pumping money to the economy. And then in connection with the very unequal consequences of direct consequences of crisis for different sectors, for different groups of people, one of the consequences will be that inequality will increase really, really steeply and quickly. And then it creates again threat for sustainability of liberal democracy of the system. Which means this is, in my opinion, this will be one of the biggest challenges. And speaking last sentence, the differences between countries, for example, Germany, which has a lot of reserves because they had surplus budget, they're very competitive, very strong. Their position on the market is much better to take money from the financial institutions. It will increase how Germany will overcome this crisis and how Italy will overcome this crisis, as Mark also mentioned, because southern countries also depend on the tourism and so on. Also, medical part of crisis is much deeper. Final result will be that these differences will be much bigger than it was before.
I think it's actually about narratives, that we should not tell a story that the world is different now. Because if we tell a story that the world is different, then there will be lots of guys who say that we have the solution. But the past has shown that the world doesn't change so much. And I think we should not give them an opportunity by telling them that the world will be different. It probably won't be different.
One point to pick up on regarding what will happen to global trade and protectionism, I think it's unavoidable, and I think that there will be greater regionalization or moving back to nation state for certain elements of production. When you're faced with China as 85% of the source of medical protection product, saying that if your government makes a negative comment about China's attitude to Taiwan, you may not get medical supplies, that's obviously an unacceptable concentration of production and dependency with the communist regime. So I think aspects of deconvergence and deglobalization, which to some extent have been running for 3 or 4 years, particularly in relation to the communist bloc, could potentially accelerate significantly. That potentially will have, it is a milder form of protectionism than tariffs or putting up barriers to other developed countries, but it's probably one that I think most developed countries will see as very necessary as a result of this crisis.
Can I just sort of follow up on you that what type of sort of deglobalization do we see? I mean, is it primarily sort of deglobalization in sort of physical sense, that there is less traveling by the people, less trading goods, while sort of digital globalization goes on, or is it more diversified globalization? So maybe the supply chains so far were primarily focusing on efficiency and perhaps not so much on sort of resilience. Perhaps they were too thin. Maybe sort of, instead of relying so much on China, other Asian countries will become more important in this sort of global game, and we would kind of see both sort of the sort of trends of regionalization and globalization going in hand. So I guess there are a lot of sort of different views in that, where we actually sort of heading. And of course, there are also views that sort of point towards sort of extreme localization. But I guess this is not sort of the most common view. And also there was some hints about the sort of distributional impacts in the Eurozone. Is it likely that there is also some kind of regionalization within Europe, where you have north versus south, or some other sort of block? So any reactions to those sort of possible developments or scenarios, anybody?
Well, if I could jump in on that.
Sure.
Given President Trump's predilection for protectionism, we already had a lot of pressure for decoupling from China in the executive branch of our government, and I think the coronavirus is going to, in effect, be the final nails in the coffin. We already have seen U.S. companies shifting out of China to other Asian economies, but I think especially with regards to certain goods that are considered necessary, personal protection equipment, I guess is the one that's hot right now. There are already discussions in Washington that I think are partially motivated by protectionism, but partially motivated, I guess, by just what do you do to prepare yourself to make sure that you have adequate supplies, because our public health authorities in the United States have done a very bad job of whether it's testing, whether it's equipment. We have all sorts of regulatory bottlenecks. So we need to do something to make sure that our country is better prepared, and I assume other countries will go through the same discussion for what happens if there's a pandemic or some other type of crisis. But then you have to mix that with the underlying pressures for protectionism, and how do you somehow achieve what might be legitimate, what are your supply of ventilators, for instance, versus the instincts of industry and politicians to try to thwart competition and globalization. And we're going to have a major challenge in the United States simply because of the president's lack of understanding about trade issues.
Yeah, but maybe we should just tell a story why it's bad. It's the reason why sort of this low productivity production moved out from Europe and the US is that it was low productivity. So the wages in US and Europe are just higher, and there's no point to produce it here when you can buy it on a cheaper price from Asia. Plus, I think we can talk about stories from countries which have had that kind of choices in the past. For example, I think the story of UK after the Second World War, that they also had the economic crisis after the Second World War, and then what they did was that they also increased the state part in the economy quite a lot. They bought some companies to the state, for example, nationalized them. So, but in in the first years it was even successful for a short period, because they were able to restart their economy very fast after the war. But for the next 10-15 years, it was quite unsuccessful, and the UK economy grew much slower than the other countries in Europe. So and also the US. So this is a clear sign that that kind of policy does not work. And I think that this is our job to tell it, that still the free market economy is the thing what works, and you should not spoil it.
Well, we have a challenge, Kaspar, getting the President of the United States to understand that, at least with regards to the issue of trade.
Yeah, you have to write some kind of nice children's book about free trade. I guess that would be probably the best way to communicate that, right? I'm sure that there are some around, but we have to find the proper one. But let me also take a few questions from the audience, and we have a question about what will be the end game of the financial crisis. Will there be hyperinflation in the Eurozone after 2 and 3 years, or some other outcome. And I guess we can sort of talk a little bit about the Eurozone, because this is something that Ivan was also discussing. If I understood you correctly, you were actually talking about that, the sort of distributional impact of the pandemic and the crisis on different European countries. And, some of the countries sort of, may have to sort of leave even maybe Eurozone, if I understood you correctly. And I'm sort of wondering how likely that kind of development might be, because as far as I understand, it's not actually that easy to leave the Eurozone. And I guess in the last crisis, some people also wanted one country at least to leave the Eurozone, but it didn't work out that way. And in that sense, might that be kind of, if the sort of Eurozone really tries to force some countries to leave, but might that be the end of the cooperation and currency in Europe? I mean, is that sort of the negative scenario, or are we relatively optimistic about the ability of Euro to survive this crisis? So anybody would like to take on those questions? Maybe first you, Ivan, because you brought it to the table.
You're right.
Also, there was a question about the inflation that came before that I asked as well, which is by the audience.
Inflation, nobody knows, of course, if they look, but what is kind of majority consensus is that this crisis and after this crisis, the risk of higher inflation is bigger than it was before. Also because this crisis is not only demand shock, but also supply shock. And also because now money are going not only to the financial sector, but money are going also to the people. Regarding Eurozone, yeah, of course, it is very uneasy to even imagine that country will have to leave. But the problem is that especially after this crisis, the difference in competitiveness, in the ability to take money on the market between Italy, for instance, and Germany will be even higher. And from long-term perspective, it is also very difficult to imagine that it can work like that for the future, because simply saying Euro will be too strong for these less competitive countries. And as I said, I don't think that it is possible to solve by the exit rule is, in my possible, unavoidable to have. Of course, not by voting, but for instance, if country is in crisis like was Greece or Spain before, it is necessary to ask for the help IMF and the ESM, European Stability Mechanism. Then country has to go through program. Program is assessed every 2 quarters, which means, for instance, a rule that if country is not fulfilling the benchmarks in 2 quarters, automatically is losing the membership in Eurozone. Because the problem is that you cannot push directly the people and politicians in any country to do reforms which they don't want. But it is necessary to have a rule that people and politicians, voters and politicians will have to know in advance that yes, it is our choice if we want to be in the club or not. If we want to be in the club, we have to fulfill some rules, some preconditions. If we will not, it is our choice. But then the result and consequence is to leave the club. This is the problem, because another kind of solution is like having the European United States of Europe, but for this it is not strong enough common European identity felt. What was possible to do in Germany by reunification, to have transfer union, is simply impossible to have on the level of European Union, because this common European identity is not strong enough to legitimize these transfers. Since finally it will have to be kind of compromise and combination of the solidarity and more reforms in less competitive countries, but without doing more reforms and to have mechanism to doing more reforms and to be more competitive, it is unsustainable.
Great, thanks. Any reactions to those talks?
Yeah,
Yeah, please.
the risks to the Eurozone now, I think, are quite a bit greater than we saw 8-9 years ago. I think also with the pressure on the Baltic pegs, there was a lack of understanding in financial markets about the policy reasons for maintaining currency pegs, single currency. Plus, relatively clear-cut structural reform issues like Greece with getting their basically government procurements to competent standards, or the balance sheet adjustment that needed to take place in Irish and Spanish property sector. The risks here are that you get major differentials in economic activity within the Eurozone. If Southern Europe cannot recover properly because of its economic composition, we can't restart travel and people movements, that presents a much more existential threat because we've got a fundamental medium-term economic lag that's coming in place there, on top of still the latent damage of a much higher debt stock from the last cycle. And that assesses the ECB can do a very, very good job in the short term of ensuring, given the facilities they have, there aren't financing issues, there aren't bond market problems, there aren't bank liquidity issues. But if in 6 months' time we're looking at Spain continuing to contract more severely, but Germany and Northern Europe starting to recover strongly because of basically policies or issues you don't have solutions to and can't get solutions to, that's where the danger point for the Eurozone would be in a very serious way.
Right, thanks. Kaspar, how about you? I mean, if you sort of start talking about all those sort of bad stories about potential developments in the Eurozone, maybe, you know, it will happen because, you know, sometimes those economic developments are sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. So maybe we shouldn't even talk about it and tell a sort of more positive story about the potential of the Eurozone. So if you're more likely to believe it, perhaps, you know, it's more likely to survive.
I think the worry has been lately that inflation is too low.
Mm-hmm.
So, and currently the consensus also seems to be that it will be quite hard to create inflation. So because, and one reason is that people are still afraid that the governments will spend money, but this will be saved on deposits probably. And this has been a puzzle for me also, that what happens to all the stimulus, what governments are doing, that somehow it should be used in economy. But if all the countries are doing it in the same time, we don't see any balance of payments crisis. So this means that most of it should just be on deposits, according to this story. Or the forecast is wrong. This could also be one possibility. Probably if countries would like to have more impact from their measures, they should create some policies in order to also get the private money into the programs somehow. For example, to not buy the private companies, but somehow try to organize some kind of funds there, which are partly also financed by the private sector. This seems to be a thing what's done in some countries, but not in all countries. And I'm not sure if the money will be so much used by people, because one reason for that is also that although the lockdown will go at some point, people are still afraid, and sort of the low confidence in people just means that they will not spend too much, and even we have still supply side restrictions. The demand will also be quite low for some time. So at least based on the sort of baseline scenario, inflation will be not an issue in a near time. Yeah.
All right, thank you. I would like to thank you all. We have to end now because this webinar is actually part of the bigger sort of movement and a bigger group of webinars. We have a next one starting out of Rome in 25 minutes or so. So if you would like to, you're welcome to join the next webinar. I would like to thank all our panelists. Thank you for your contribution. And thanks for contributing to the Free Market Roadshow. And I hope to see you again, and I hope to talk with you again. And thank you for all our listeners. Thank you for all our participants. Thanks for questions. and you're able to rewatch this webinar on YouTube. So have a good afternoon, have a good evening, have a good morning, depending on where you are. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.